What would have beaten you faster? When British historian B.H. Little Hart asked that question to captured German commanders in 1946, he expected a technical answer, something about air power, logistics, American industry. He did not expect an indictment. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, looked at him and calmly described a strategic gift the Allies had handed Germany in September 1944, a gift that cost tens of thousands of American lives and extended the war by 6 months. Little Hart later wrote that he realized he wasn't hearing a critique of a map or a maneuver. He was hearing that the silence of the guns could have begun half a year earlier. Every grave dug between September 1944 and May 1945 suddenly felt like a choice. By late August 1944, the German army in France wasn't retreating, it was disintegrating. The Falaise Pocket had been a catastrophe. Entire divisions were annihilated, tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands captured. The roads were littered for miles with abandoned tanks, artillery and trucks, machines without fuel, units without commanders, commanders without soldiers. When Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take command of the Western Front, what he found horrified him. Model was Hitler's fireman, the man sent to every disaster, but this time there was nothing left to save. He had fragments of units, rear echelon clerks pressed into combat, teenagers, old men, soldiers without weapons. On paper, Germany still had an army. In reality, Model had fewer than 100 operational tanks across the entire Western Front. The Allies, meanwhile, had 12 armored divisions ready to attack. Between them and Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, there was almost nothing. For 3 weeks in September 1944, Germany was effectively defenseless. Allied intelligence knew it. Patton's Third Army knew it. The soldiers racing across France could feel it. German resistance was collapsing faster than the Allies could advance. Men talked openly about being home by Christmas. They didn't know the brakes were already being pulled from a desk hundreds of miles away. By early September, George Patton reached the Moselle River, the last major natural barrier before the German border. Beyond it lay the Siegfried Line, thin, incomplete, barely manned. Beyond that lay the Rhine. Beyond that lay Germany itself. Patton's intelligence chief delivered report after report with the same conclusion: the German army was broken. One concentrated thrust would end the war. Walter Model knew it too. Every day without an Allied breakthrough felt like a miracle. He scraped together anyone who could hold a rifle. He pulled units from quiet sectors. He prayed for time, because time was the only thing Germany needed. And time is exactly what the Allies gave him. On September 1, 1944, Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground forces. He faced a decision that would determine how the war would end: concentrate everything on a single axis and strike straight into Germany, or advance on a broad front and keep all Allied armies moving together. One option offered speed and decisive victory, the other offered political stability. Patton wanted the concentrated thrust. American doctrines supported it. German defenses could not stop it. But Eisenhower wasn't just commanding armies, he was managing an alliance. Bernard Montgomery demanded priority in the North. Winston Churchill pressured Roosevelt to elevate British forces. Montgomery threatened to bypass Eisenhower entirely and appeal directly to London if he was denied. Patton, meanwhile, was politically toxic. The slapping incidents made him impossible to publicly elevate. Giving him supreme operational authority would have caused an uproar in Washington. Then there was logistics. Antwerp, one of Europe's largest ports, was captured on September 4th, but German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary leading to it. Until the estuary was cleared, the port was useless. Clearing it was Montgomery's responsibility. He did not do it. Instead, Montgomery proposed a gamble, Operation Martin Garden, an airborne assault to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Montgomery promised Eisenhower it would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower agreed. Montgomery received priority for fuel, ammunition, and transport aircraft. American airborne divisions were placed under British command. Patton's tanks sat motionless with empty fuel tanks while the road into Germany remained open. Patton warned them, stopping now would give the Germans time. No one listened. Martin Garden launched on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation in history, and it failed catastrophically. At Arnhem, British paratroopers landed directly on top of German units they had been told did not exist. They were surrounded, cut off, and destroyed. Of the 10,000 men of the British 1st Airborne Division, barely 2,000 escaped. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The war would not end by Christmas. The tragedy wasn't only the men lost in the forests around Arnhem, it was the fuel that never reached Patton's tanks, the momentum that had been traded for a shortcut that led nowhere. While the Allies regrouped, Walter Model worked like a man resurrecting a corpse. He activated every reserve formation, conscripted factory workers, rebuilt the West Wall. By September, Germany had a defensive line. By October, reserves. By November, Model was planning a counteroffensive. The Allies gave him 6 weeks. 6 weeks that should never have existed. Model later admitted he knew exactly why Germany survived the autumn of 1944. The enemy had spread their strength instead of delivering the killing blow. It was a strategic gift. The war dragged on through winter, through the Hürtgen forest, through the Ardennes, through frozen fields and ruined cities. Germany surrendered in May 1945, 6 months before it should have ended. When Little Hart finished his interviews, he understood the truth. Germany was not saved by brilliance. It was saved by hesitation, and history paid for that hesitation in blood.
And then the interrogations began. Individually, the testimonies B.H. Little Hart collected were damning. Taken together, they were devastating. When he cross-referenced the interviews, a single conclusion emerged. One Allied politicians would have preferred never to see written down. All the German generals to whom I talked were of the opinion that the Allied Supreme Command had missed a great opportunity of ending the war in the autumn of 1944. Gerd von Rundstedt did not hedge. He told Little Hart exactly what the Allies should have done. The best course, he said, would have been to concentrate a truly powerful striking force and drive it through Aachen into the Ruhr. Strategically and politically, Berlin was the ultimate objective, but Germany's real strength lay in the north. Whoever held northern Germany, Rundstedt explained, held Germany itself. He paused, then delivered his conclusion. Such a breakthrough, combined with Allied air supremacy, would have torn apart the weak German front and forced the collapse of the Reich. This was not an excuse for defeat. It was professional military analysis from the man who commanded Germany's defense in the West. Rundstedt was explaining exactly how the Allies could have destroyed him faster and why they had not. He was not alone. General Blumentritt called the Allied approach a gift. Hasso von Montefiore described the broad front strategy as fundamentally wrong. Kurt Meyer, the SS Panzer commander, was the most blunt of all. The backbone of German resistance, he said, was already broken. They were simply waiting for the Allies to notice. General after general reached the same verdict. The Reich had been given a second lease on life because the killing blow never came. Littleheart asked the obvious follow-up question. If a concentrated thrust was the answer, who should have led it? The Germans were not advocating for Montgomery, despite his arguments for a northern drive. They had found him predictable, methodical. You always knew what he would do next. Omar Bradley was competent and steady, but cautious. German staffs could anticipate his movements and prepare defenses accordingly. But when the question turned to Patton, the tone changed. Rundstedt reportedly told a Stars and Stripes reporter after his capture that Patton was the Allies' best commander. Speed, aggression, deep armored thrusts, relentless pressure. That was the American way of war that terrified German generals. That was the formula they said would have destroyed them. And that was exactly what coalition politics had suppressed. Patton was right. The enemy confirmed it. Once the September window closed, the Allies faced months of fighting that German generals later said were unnecessary. The Hurtgen Forest was one of the worst examples. American forces spent 3 months fighting through dense woodland for terrain that could have been bypassed entirely. 33,000 casualties for ground of no strategic value. One of the bloodiest battles of the European War. While senior commanders debated coalition harmony, 19-year-olds rotted in frozen foxholes, fighting yard by yard through a forest that should have been behind them, against an enemy that should already have surrendered. The Siegfried Line had to be taken by bloody frontal assault because it had not been outflanked when it was weak. The battles dragged on through autumn and into winter. American soldiers died taking ground that should have been secured months earlier. Every casualty had a name. Every death sent a telegram to a family back home. Meanwhile, German generals sat in captivity, explaining calmly that it did not have to happen this way. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive through the Ardennes. It succeeded initially because Eisenhower's broad front had left Allied defenses thin. There were no reserves where they were needed. The Germans achieved complete surprise. 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks, 19,000 dead. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered more than 7,000 men, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. This was the offensive Walter Model had spent the autumn preparing. This was what the 6 weeks of September and October had bought Germany. Time to rebuild, time to reorganize, time to plan one last desperate blow. German generals never claimed the Battle of the Bulge would have succeeded regardless. They openly acknowledged that it was only possible because the Allies had given them time. A concentrated Allied thrust in September, they said, would have forced Germany's surrender before any counteroffensive could be mounted. Every compromise made to keep a general satisfied slowed the advance. Every delay lengthened the casualty lists. The Germans understood coalition politics better than the Allies realized. One captured officer told interrogators that the Allies were fighting 2 wars, one against Germany and one against each other. Germany only needed to survive the second long enough to recover for the first. Every time Montgomery and Patton competed for resources, Germany gained time. Every time Eisenhower compromised to preserve unity, German defensive lines grew stronger. Rundstedt recognized this clearly. He had studied the Allied command structure. He knew that Eisenhower's role was as much political as military. He knew that concentration of force was politically impossible, even when it was militarily obvious. The broad front was not a military strategy, it was a political necessity, and German generals understood that distinction perfectly. Historians still debate whether a concentrated thrust could truly have ended the war in 1944. Supply lines were stretched, ports were damaged, a single thrust might have outrun its logistics and been isolated. But those arguments came from Allied planners who had reasons to justify their decisions. The German commanders who actually faced that threat had a different view. Model had nothing in September. The Ruhr was open. The Siegfried Line was barely manned. A concentrated attack with everything available would have broken through before Germany could recover. The men who would have had to stop that attack said it could not have been stopped. The enemies trying to destroy the Allied armies understood Allied leadership better than many in Washington did. German generals saw what politicians refused to admit. Speed mattered more than harmony. Concentration beat dispersion. The commander most capable of ending the war fastest was not the commander who received the resources. Eisenhower kept the alliance together. That was his task, and he accomplished it. But keeping the alliance together was not the same as ending the war as fast as possible. History remembers Eisenhower as the man who won the war. German generals remembered him as the man who allowed them to survive the autumn of 1944. There's a difference between winning a war and ending it as fast as possible. You can see that difference in the dates carved in headstones. Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Montefiore, Model, they all said the same thing. The war could have ended in 1944. It did not because political considerations overrode military logic. They told us what would have beaten them. They told us who should have led. They delivered their professional judgment without hesitation. The question history leaves behind is simple. Was anyone listening?